Good evening. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the curator of the Gunn Historical Museum in Washington, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for Rossiter's Riverside Retreat, which is being co-sponsored by the Gunn Historical Museum and Steep Rock Association. Washington, Connecticut's Chepaug River Valley, including the renowned cliff known as Steep Rock, is one of the most picturesque and conservation-worthy landscapes in Litchfield County. This evening, Carol Santoleri, our distinguished guest, will explore the history of Ehrick Rossiter's beautiful Steep Rock Park, which he started acquiring in the 1880s, and Joseph West, who began photographing the park a decade later, and whose photos are now preserved at the Gunn Museum. Jean Solomon, a trustee of the Gunn Memorial Library and Museum, will be introducing Carol. During this lecture, we ask that you please mute both your audio and video settings. If you have questions, you may submit them throughout the lecture in the chat box, and Carol will answer some of them at the end. Please note that our next guest lecturer is historian and author Thomas Gilbert, who will present How Baseball Happened, Outrageous Lies and the True Story Revealed on Monday, April 19th at 6:30 p.m. Please mark your calendars and register for this presentation on the Gunn Museum's website. Now I'd like to hand it over to Jean.
Hello and good evening. My name is Jean Solomon. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer, Carol Santoleri. Carol, a landscape historian, photographer, and author of The History of Steep Rock Association, The Jewel in the Crown, brings both an artistic eye and a research-based perspective to her work. She has a fine arts degree in landscape architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design, a master's degree in early modern landscape history from Columbia University's Department of Art History and Archaeology, and 6 years of experience as a curatorial research assistant at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Department of European Paintings. All proceeds from the sale of her book go to Steep Rock Association. Thank you, Carol, for your participation here this evening. And now I'll hand this over to you.
Good evening, and thank you for joining me. Tonight, I would like to take you on a journey back in time. The era, the turn of the 20th century. The place, Washington, Connecticut. We'll head back to 1886 when Steep Rock Association founder Ehrick Rossiter began creating a retreat in the Chepaug River Valley. Through the medium of then and now photographs, many never before seen, we will explore the development of Rossiter's Riverside Retreat, then known as Steep Rock Park. We will see it through the eyes of Joseph West, whose 100-year-old photographs of Washington are in the collection of the Gunn Historical Museum. If you were to climb to the summit of the Steep Rock hillside, you would be standing on the site that inspired the renowned architect Ehrick Rossiter to found one of America's oldest land trusts, now known as Steep Rock Association. From this lofty overlook, a tree-covered cliff drops to the Chepaug River 400 feet below. The breathtaking view from the top reveals an array of colorful ecosystems delineated by nature rather than lot lines. Chief among them is the river itself, which curves around a peninsular hillside, having the uncanny symmetry of a clamshell. In the distance, verdant hills stretch to the horizon. The reciprocal view, looking back toward the summit of Steep Rock from the clamshell-shaped hillside, is equally impressive. A sheer bedrock cliff rises from the river to a rounded peak. This view has a place in local lore. More than 300 years ago, the steep rocky cliff and summit were already known as Steep Rock. As early as 1706, both Steep Rock and the Chepaug River were well-known landmarks, important enough to be mentioned in the 6th purchase of land from Native Americans by the founders of Woodbury, the town from which a portion of Washington was later carved. So who was Ehrick Rossiter, the founder of Steep Rock Association? Ehrick Rossiter was born in Paris in 1854 while his parents were on an extended honeymoon. He lived most of his life in New York City and Connecticut in an era bookended by the American Civil War and the two World Wars, wars in which he was either too young or too old to participate. His father was a painter of landscapes and allegories and a prominent member of the Hudson River School. His mother was the daughter of a wealthy real estate developer. After giving birth to her third child, she died when Ehrick was 3, and his father remarried 3 years later. After attending the Gunn School during his middle and high school years, Ehrick entered the newly formed Cornell School of Architecture, becoming one of the first to graduate from the program in 1875. 2 years later, he married Mary Heath, the daughter of a successful lumber merchant from Pittsburgh. Initially, he practiced architecture in New York City. Later, he expanded his business into Northwest Connecticut, where he quickly became the starchitect of choice. He died in 1941 in White Plains, New York. Rossiter first explored the Chepaug River Valley in 1865 to 71 when he was a student at the Gunn School. From ages 11 to 17, he was one of roughly 30 boarding students living in the home of and studying with schoolmaster Frederick Gunn and his wife, Abigail Brinsmaid Gunn. Rossiter deeply admired his teacher, who was almost 40 years his senior. In a long and touching eulogy, Rossiter described how Gunn focused on the natural world and moral values, urging his students to lead a hearty outdoor life in order to develop manliness, fortitude, and self-reliance. As seen in illustrations by William Hamilton Gibson, a Rossiter contemporary, Gunn students were often outside, fishing, swimming, skating, hunting, socializing, and tramping and camping. Initially, sports may have posed a challenge for Rossiter, who described himself as a delicately nurtured boy from the city. But regardless of whether he participated in some or all outdoor activities, the valley would have been his teenage hangout, the place where he grew from a sensitive preteen into an ambitious young man. As seen here on Bell Hill, Washington was a quiet town in the 1860s when Rossiter was a student. Fields and meadows stretched into the distance. Houses were few and far between. Horsepower referred to horses, not cars. Roads were dirt, travel was slow and local. Things began to change in 1872 when the Chepaug Valley Railroad opened. The depot buzzed with activity. It took more than a decade, however, for the Washington Green to be transformed into the elegant neighborhood it was destined to become. It seems that Rossiter was to be the catalyst for change. He bought a prime piece of property on the Green overlooking the Chepaug River Valley. It featured a dramatic rock outcrop and a famous rocking boulder known as Sampson's Rock. Here he sited the rocks, the home he would build for his growing family. Soon after starting construction on the rocks, Rossiter, then age 30, found himself in demand. The Washington Green was ripe for expansion. As seen here in a wonderful winter picture of the rocks, the architect had style. His buildings were modern, spacious, and tastefully integrated into the landscape. It is difficult to imagine what Washington would be like today if Rossiter had not taken the town under his wing. Designing over 30 homes and public buildings in and around the Green, he breathed life into the neighborhood, filling it with homes, schools, a library, and places of worship. As his business boomed, the Green blossomed, expanding in every direction with Rossiter-designed homes. To the north on Parsonage Lane and Old North Road, to the east on Wickham Road, Sabaday Lane, and Woodbury Road, to the south on Roxbury Road, Ferry Bridge Road, and Kirby Brook Road, and to the west on Kirby Road, Rossiter Road, and Barnes Road. In 1886, Rossiter, then age 32, started acquiring property along the Schuylkill River, including the west bank of Mitchell's Hole, a popular swimming hole seen here in a drawing by Gibson. At the time, land conservation and preservation were new ideas. Decades would pass before the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service were established in 1905 and 1916. Land trusts were a thing of the future. Rossiter was clearly ahead of his time. So who sowed the seeds of preservation in his mind? Very likely it was Frederick Gunn, a Yale-trained botanist who skipped classes to tramp through the countryside with his students on warm, sunny days, sharing his love of nature. Gunn's ideals must have rubbed off on Rossiter. At some point, the architect decided to buy enough land in the valley to create a park. As it turned out, this would not be an easy task. It took the architect 20 years to assemble 15 pieces of property on the two hillsides, the Steep Rock and Clamshell hillsides, which would become known as Steep Rock Park. Thanks to the efforts of Joseph West, we are fortunate to have some 100 pictures of Steep Rock Park as it looked in Rossiter's day. As a boy, Joseph Irenaeus West came to Washington from New York City to study at the Gunn School, where he became a member of the photography club. After graduating in 1893, he married his high school sweetheart, a local girl named Evelyn Kingman. West set up a photography studio next to their home in the depot, and for many years, he photographed the sights and scenes of Washington. Rossiter may well have been an important client. West photographed not only the Rossiter designed landscapes of Steep Rock Park, but also many Rossiter designed homes and public buildings around town. In West's day, photography was neither simple nor inexpensive. Cameras were not point and shoots. They offered neither automatic settings nor instantaneous digital results. Instead, West would have used a large format camera similar to the one shown. An assortment of lenses were attached to one end of the camera, and various sized glass plate negatives were inserted into the other. The bellows could be extended or compressed, raised or lowered, shifted, tilted, or swung to create different effects. Over time, I came to realize that West never set up his equipment far from his horse and buggy, seen here tucked into the side of a road in Steep Rock Park. Why? Because glass plate negatives were large and cumbersome, ranging in size from 5 by 7 inches to 11 by 14 inches. They were stored in large wooden boxes. Cameras and tripods were made of wood as well. For West, it would not have been easy to lug his equipment around. It also became clear to me that West, who was 22 years younger than Rossiter, represented a new generation. By 1911, he was driving a Model T Roadster, which topped out at 40 to 45 miles an hour. As seen here in front of the Washington Supply Company, cars had joined horses and trains to become common forms of conveyance. Horses, however, which averaged 3 to 12 miles an hour, were soon to be phased out. This was the era in which Rossiter conceived of Steep Rock Park as a place to slow down and enjoy the countryside. Rossiter was a carriage driver. Carriage driving was a recreational sport for gentlemen who dressed in suits and gentlewomen who donned fancy hats. Generally traveling solo, carriage drivers took the reins from the comfort of padded seats. They drove to get away from the stresses of daily life, not to be pushed off the road by Model Ts. From his home on Washington Green, Rossiter could have taken any one of several routes to Steep Rock Park. Following a combination of main roads and back roads, He could have traveled down the east or west side of the Chippewa River. Then, as now, Kirby Brook Road was a narrow lane that dropped abruptly from Roxbury Road before winding along the edge of the brook to Tunnel Road. Although I didn't get a chance to replicate these photos due to icy road conditions, the scenery remains much the same. This was the route most photographed by Joseph West and was probably the route that Rossiter took most often. Alternatively, Rossiter could have traveled to Steep Rock Park by crisscrossing the river, thereby passing several local landmarks: an old mill on River Road, a golf links on Barnes Road, Holiday House on Tunnel Road, all marked here with ginger stars. Mills, factories, and founderings were once common sites on the Chippewa River and its tributaries. Seen here, Kilbourne's Mill and Dam was in operation for over 100 years, from the 1830s to 1947. Just beyond the mill was a 10-foot high dam. Like the unseen edge of an infinity pool, the dam held water in a deep, wide mill pond, here beautifully captured on a still day. The land on the left bank of the river sported golf links, today part of the Steep Rock Preserve. The golf links was established in 1889 by John Brinsmaid, Frank Heath, and Richard Barnes. On the east bank, it stretched between the Barnes home west lawn at 59 Barnes Road and the Heath's home, Glen Knoll, at 21 Barnes Road. Curiously, the links continued across the river, where one or more holes were played on a flat river terrace. The terrace can be seen here, filling the center of the picture above the stone wall. A seasonal pontoon lift the holes on the opposing banks. The river itself, then swollen by the mill dam, would have made a formidable water hazard if indeed anyone dared to drive a ball over it. Thus, it is not surprising that circa 1903, when land became available on what is now Golf Course Road in Washington, members abandoned the old course for a new one, today's Washington Golf Club. My favorite story about the golf links came from Bill Bader's book, The Light at the North End of the Tunnel. Apparently, his family, local butchers, grazed 500 sheep on the golf course. In a win-win arrangement, the sheep kept the grass clipped, and the Baders supplied their customers with fresh lamb. In this picture by West, one can see that the sheep must have been well fed. There was plenty of grass. Visible from Tunnel Road, a third landmark in the area would have been Holiday House. Here, for 25 years, wool merchant and philanthropist Edward Hook Van Ingen and his wife, Mary McLean Van Ingen, presided over a pastoral retreat for young working-class women from New York City. The retreat featured a 3-story Rossiter-designed guest house overlooking the Chippewa River Valley. In a field by the river, now the Riding Ring Meadow, a garden provided fruits and vegetables for a household of 60 to 65 people. Young Black people studying hotel services at Hampton College in Virginia were invited by the Van Ingens to put their skills to work at the guest house, where they received on-the-job training. In its heyday, Holiday House was surrounded by colorful gardens and manicured lawns. Guests came for 2-week stays throughout the summer. Activities included croquet, bowling, swings, archery, and baseball on the grounds, reading, crochet, and embroidery on the porch, picnics, walks, and drives in Steep Rock Park, and in the evenings, short plays, masquerade balls, hymn sings, and the recreation of scenes from books and famous paintings. Interactions with young men were strictly forbidden. To this day, the old stone foundations of Holiday House form a cohesive whole when viewed from the air. Large covered porches facing west and south, seen here to the left and bottom, opened from spacious public rooms to feature extensive views over the valley. Imagine the sunsets. Seen at the top of the image, a dormitory ran the length of the guest house. A pie-shaped terrace in the middle may have been used as an out kitchen. On the right, a curvilinear retaining wall separated the grounds from the forest. West captured a noteworthy, although rather bleak-looking moment in the history of Holiday House after the retreat was closed in 1918. As the grounds filled with weeds, everything from paneling and flooring to porches and beams was made available to local townspeople. One wing of the guest house was reassembled on the schoolyard in Washington Depot, where it served as the high school for many years. Visitors to Holiday House arrived from New York City on the Chippewa Valley Railroad and debarked at a whistle stop known as Valley Station. Initially, they accessed the station by crossing the river on a crude timber bridge that sat high above the water, seen here in a substantially enlarged detail of a 1903 photograph by West. The timber bridge spanned the river from Tunnel Road to a river terrace known as Moody's Potato Field. Seen here, it had a raised wooden walkway on the left and a vehicular surface on the right. On the near bank, it connected to a surprisingly high, steep embankment. On the far bank, it merged into a circular driveway leading to Valley Station, where Holiday House staff would have greeted visitors and helped with luggage. The timber bridge was replaced by 1905 with a sleek, modern suspension bridge built using plans and parts supplied by John A. Roebling's Sons Company. This was the successor firm to that of their father, John A. Roebling, the renowned designer of New York City's Brooklyn Bridge. Although the cables and walkway were removed circa 1918 when Holiday House was dismantled, the old stone abutments that held the bridge in place have been preserved by SRA and can be seen to this day. No matter which route Rossiter took to get to Steep Rock Park, he would have crossed the tracks of the Chippewa Valley Railroad at least once or twice. In 1870 to 72, the Little Railroad was built at the edge of the Chippewa River on a north-south route between Litchfield and Hollyville. In Washington, trains stopped at 4 stations, seen here with ginger stars. Although business slowed with the advent of automobiles, service continued for 76 years until 1948. For railroad passengers and crew, the ride through Washington would have been exhilarating. As seen here, trains traveled on rail beds cleared of trees to prevent forest fires lit by locomotive sparks. As the rail cars chugged up and down hills and wound in gentle arcs around the river's edge, passengers would see expansive and ever-changing views of the countryside from their windows. At what was then the northeast corner of Steep Rock Park, the railroad crossed the Chippewa River on a bridge, here marked with a ginger star. Rossiter would have seen the bridge from the Dugway, a reinforced riverbank built to support Tunnel Road, where it traversed a steep hillside. The bridge was a simple truss bridge sitting on concrete foundations set into the banks and riverbed. Its remains can be seen to this day. The reciprocal view from the bridge toward the Dugway would have thrilled the young women heading to Holiday House. From the bridge, they could see their destination sitting high on a hill in the distance. Placing his camera directly on the bridge, West composed a one-point perspective in which the lines of river and trees converge on the guest house. A roller coaster type of experience awaited passengers heading south. After crossing the railroad bridge, trains climbed 120 feet on a rail bed cut into the valley wall, where breathtaking views of the river unfolded. At the top, passengers were plunged into a dark tunnel cut through the bedrock. Exiting the tunnel, the train made a sharp turn to the south, and passengers coasted downhill to Judd's Bridge. Continuing on, they would soon reach the phenomenon of Roxbury Falls. Excuse me. While much of what we have seen thus far is now part of the Steep Rock Preserve, none of it ever belonged to Ehrick Rossiter. In the early 20th century, the Rossiters owned 3 parcels of land in the valley, making up about a third of what is now the Steep Rock Preserve. As far as I know, only 2 of the 3 parcels were substantially improved by Rossiter and photographed by West. Here, noted with ginger stars, are those 2 parcels, the Steep Rock and Clamshell Hillsides. Forming the heart of Steep Rock Park, they contained some of the valley's most iconic features. The Steep Rock hillside featured the cliff and summit of Steep Rock, acres of old-growth hemlock forest, a popular picnic spot known as the Hemlocks, a grand entrance to the park on Pine Drive and the Avenue of Pines, and 3 fords that cross the river. The Clamshell hillside featured the Clamshell Overlook, Clamshell Drive, and a variety of carriage roads, all providing picturesque views of the countryside. Rossiter began acquiring land in 1886 when loggers threatened to exploit the trees that remained in the valley. He must have known in advance exactly what part of the countryside he wanted to preserve. He chose 2 of the most geologically intriguing and innately beautiful hillsides in the area. Curiously, the high point of each hillside overlooks the low point of the other, and the low point of each hillside faces the high point of the other, creating a unique and often bewildering land formation. For example, when you stop to enjoy the view on Hauser Bridge looking downstream, you are standing at the low point of the Steep Rock hillside and facing the high point of the Clamshell hillside. Conversely, when you climb to Steep Rock summit, you are standing on the high point of the Steep Rock hillside and facing the low point of the Clamshell hillside. Carved out by the Chepaug River, the 2 peninsular hillsides are interlocking meander spurs that not only slope gently down to the river's edge in opposite directions, but also fall steeply to the river from peaks facing divergent directions. If this doesn't make sense to you, just remember that if you lose your bearings on the Steep Rock hillside, you simply follow the trail downhill to its low point at Hauser Bridge. But if you lose your bearings on the Clamshell hillside, you must first follow a trail uphill to its heights at 5 Corners before following a second trail downhill to Tunnel Road. The first land that Rossiter acquired in 1886 was on the Steep Rock hillside, a parcel with no direct access to public roads. These days, it is hard to imagine the role that fords, or shallow river crossings, played in the history of Steep Rock Association. For carriage drivers to reach the summit in Rossiter's day, they had to direct their horses into the river. There were no inland routes wide and level enough for horse-drawn carriages to get to the summit. To complicate matters, carriage drivers couldn't just cross the river wherever they pleased. More often than not, the banks were too steep or rocky, or the water was too deep. Consequently, fords were established and maintained at specific places where banks and riverbed could be safely negotiated. This obviously is an example of a place that would be hard to cross. In Rossiter's day, there were 3 fords that provided access to the steep rock hillside. 2 crossed the river from Tunnel Road, and a 3rd crossed from the clamshell. Marked here with ginger stars, to the east was the long ford, to the west was the double ford, and to the south was the ford at the Avenue of Pines. From the east, the long ford crossed the river at an angle over a wide stretch of water extending its length. It was nicknamed Rossiter's Ford in 1901 when West photographed the crossing overlaid with a rustic walkway that Rossiter must have designed and or funded. Despite its many benefits, the walkway could not have lasted long. A spring thaw, summer rainstorm, fall flood, or winter ice storm could easily have washed it away. The ford, however, remained in use until 1949. Beautifully sited, the long ford featured scenic views upstream and down that were visible only from the middle of the river. Downstream was a wide and lengthy view, which converged on a tree-topped hillside rising to a peak above the river. Upstream, West photographed a hillside owned by Rossiter, which, too steep for horses, remained unimproved until the 1950s. Today, it houses a stunning but challenging boulder-strewn trail nicknamed the Goat Trail. Carriage drivers who crossed the long ford to the steep rock hillside would have enjoyed a pleasant ride south on a flat forested floodplain. As described by a friend of the Rossiter family, in the summer of 1906-07, I visited Edith Rossiter in the house her architect father built. Mr. Rossiter had a pair of fine small bay horses, which he drove and took us down into the valley, across the river on a ford made of stone slabs through a heavily wooded area where we often picnicked. Being a nature lover, I responded to Mr. Rossiter's pride in the glorious hemlock trees, wildflowers, and scenery, whereupon he related that soon after his marriage, he learned a lumber company was negotiating to buy this tract and cut down the trees. Immediately, the Rossiters postponed building their house and used the money to buy the Hemlock Grove, now Steep Rock Park, to save it from destruction for the town. That was written in 1971 to then curator of the Gunn Museum by a woman, Reba Forbes Morse. The westernmost crossing maintained by Rossiter was the double ford. This ford flanked an island requiring not just one, but 2 dips into the Chippewa River to reach the opposite shore. Circa 1897, it was crossed by the bridge to Lucky Island, seen here in a photograph published in a contemporary travel book. Strategically located, the ford would have been part of a major thoroughfare between the Clamshell and Steep Rock hillsides, a connection sorely lacking today. The southernmost crossing was the ford at the Avenue of Pines. Nicknamed the Short Ford, this crossing provided the most direct route between Tunnel Road and Steep Rock Summit. At the end of the ford, Rossiter created a grand entrance to his Riverside retreat. Here, he planted a hedge of white pines along the river, calling it Pine Drive, and an alley of pines to the summit, calling it the Avenue of Pines. Facing south and often flooded with sunlight, Pine Drive was a long, broad thoroughfare that linked fords, carriage roads, and public roads to Steep Rock Drive, then the only route to the summit. At one end of Pine Drive was the long ford from Tunnel Road, and at the other end was the double ford from the clamshell. Between them was the ford at the Avenue of Pines. Impressive in its day, the Avenue of Pines led directly uphill from the eponymous ford, forming a dramatic passageway to the summit. The white pines that lined the avenue were ideal for the situation. A rapid growing, long-lived evergreen species native to Connecticut, white pines are naturally symmetrical around a single stem in their early years and mature to a broad, irregular crown. Established trees often live for 200 to 400 years and reach 100 to 200 feet in height. Curiously, the specimens seen here must have had their leaders cut at an early age to encourage a low branching sculptural shape. Taking Steep Rock Drive to the summit, Rossiter would have passed through the thick hemlock forests he had saved from logging. In his day, forests were just beginning to be recognized as critical places for public recreation, providing fresh air and exercise for an increasingly confined workforce. Here, West captures the laurel that blossomed in the dapple shade along the roads of Steep Rock Park. The panoramic view from Steep Rock Summit at the high end of Steep Rock Drive would have astonished visitors who made it to the top. In 1900, the tallest building in New York City was the 31-story Park Row building near City Hall. Topping out at 390 feet, it was shorter than the 400-foot rise from the Chappaqua River to the summit. Few people would have ever seen a view from such a height. As described in 1887 by Gunn graduate Clarence Deming, sometimes in summer, the whole school went for a night's camp to Steep Rock. At the top, you stand on the brink of a vast gulf, but a gulf filled with picturesque beauties. Directly in front and sheer down breaks a precipice 400 feet high. Right and left of the cliff turns in a the cliff turns in a mathematical curve, sloping down in diminishing spurs. Far below, the Chappaqua forms a grand semicircle around the clamshell, as perfect in its lines as if nature had done her work with a compass. Lavishing attention on the clamshell hillside, Rossiter spent a great deal of creative energy improving the property, far more than he did on the higher, steeper, more densely forested Steep Rock hillside. For Rossiter, the massive Steep Rock hillside was like an old master, sculpted by the hand of God. The modest clamshell hillside, however, was like a slab of marble, waiting to be brought to life. He was not without reason. On the higher hillside, Mother Nature had honed the cliff and summit to perfection. On the lower hillside, however, the architect could sculpt the natural terrain into a work of art. The project to improve the clamshell hillside was not without its challenges. In Rossiter's there were two ways to reach the hillside, shown here with ginger stars. One was by crossing the double ford from the Steep Rock hillside. As strange as it may seem, the other was by climbing Tunnel Road to the top of the railroad tunnel. Although the clamshell hillside was surrounded by water on three sides, visitors had to follow a series of counterintuitive steps to get there. After traveling south down Tunnel Road, they had to leave the river's edge at the base of clamshell hillside and travel not only inland, but uphill. At the crest of the hill, Rossiter created a second grand entrance to his Riverside retreat. Flanking a carriage road leading onto the clamshell hillside, He installed a rustic gateway consisting of stone walls curving towards pillars adorned with sculptural rock arrangements. Visitors who passed through the gateway would travel north along a wooded ridge to Five Corners, here marked with a ginger star. Five Corners was a crossroads on the heights of the clamshell hillside, where 2 trails provided access from Tunnel Road and 3 trails fanned out across the peninsular hillside. Each of the latter 3 led to the river's edge through a unique series of field, forest, and successional landscapes. One of Rossiter's first stops on the hillside would surely have been the Clamshell Overlook, which featured a spectacular view of the countryside. Here, the architect had cleared trees from a steep hillside to open a wide and expansive bird's eye view. The river stretched east from the overlook, framing many a sunrise. Seen here to the left of the river is the grand entrance to the Steep Rock hillside, where Pine Drive is edged with young white pine trees recently planted. On the right are the railroad tracks, where a train has just emerged from the tunnel, pouring smoke and steam from its smokestack. Rossiter was applauded by all who visited his park. In 1897, travel writer George Alson Marvin wrote, "Mr. Rossiter has done more than any other man to open to view the heart of picturesque Washington. About 10 years ago, he became owner of Steep Rock, a remarkable ledge, 400 feet high, overhanging the Chippewa, which runs in the form of a horseshoe at its base. By degrees, he has added to this 400 acres of what may be called primeval forest. Here, Mr. Rossiter has built about 6 miles of driving road following the winding of the river, which it crosses several times by low bridges, over bluffs and ridges, under the rock and onto its summit. This drive is pronounced by intelligent travels, unsurpassed in loveliness in this country or any other." Beyond the overlook, Rossiter could have continued down the eastern edge of the hillside on Rossiter Drive, which offered striking views across the river. Cut into the edge of a steep valley wall, the road was wide, flat, and free of rocky intrusions. How could such precise excavation have been accomplished in the days before backhoes? Probably by hand and horse. Although it is not known who actually built the roads through Steep Rock Park, Rossiter spent a significant amount of money improving the clamshell. When he transferred the property to the land trust in 1929, the board reimbursed him for $7,500 worth of improvements. Living in an era when laborers made well under $1 a day, the architect may have had a small grounds crew working steadily on his park for many years. Continuing down Rossiter Drive, the trail passed through an old growth forest dominated by eastern hemlocks, which covered the steep slopes. At the base of the drive was the double ford, where equestrians and carriage drivers traveled easily between the clamshell and Steep Rock hillsides. West took this picture in mid-September 1905, just after a storm had hit parts of the Northeast, apparently raising the water level in the Chippewa River and flooding part of the trail. Lucky Island can be seen across the water in the distance. Another route Rossiter could have taken from Five Corners was the Middle Road. If known as Garrity Road, which I believe it was, it would have been lined with lush stands of mountain laurel, for which the clamshell was famous. West took 40 pictures of the laurel in bloom, more than any other single subject in Steep Rock Park. Designated the state flower by Connecticut's General Assembly in 1907, this native plant has long been esteemed for its masses of fragrant pink and white blossoms, which decorate the New England countryside each June. The middle road was the longest and sunniest route from Five Corners to the river. It led through open fields that then covered a substantial portion of the Clamshell's heights. From these fields, a fresh view of the bare, rocky face of Steep Rock greeted visitors at every turn in the road. Then, as now, nature strove to take back the fields by converting them to forest. It must have taken a great deal of effort for Rossiter to maintain this iconic view year after year. The westernmost of the three trails leading north from Five Corners was shorter and steeper than the others, making it the most direct route to the river. This road led to an intersection known as Two Roads. Here, visitors could make a sharp turn to the south to a picnic spot by the river, or head north for an extended drive on Clamshell Road. In Rossiter's day, Clamshell Road, which circled the clamshell at the base of a bluff, would have been a favorite destination. While the road itself occupied a wide flat bank, perfect for horse-drawn carriages, the valley wall across the river formed a dramatic amphitheater. Covered in trees, it rose steeply and steadily from low points at each end to the summit midway between. Joseph West was smitten with Clamshell Road. He revered the extraordinary one-of-a-kind trees that grew at its edge. Why had they not been cut down with the rest of the trees on Clamshell Hillside? He noted the shorelines that barely existed. Why didn't the floodwaters wash them away? He marveled at the rocks embedded in the river. Were they left by a glacier? Did they fall from the cliff? He knew when he was passing beneath the remarkable precipice known as Steep Rock, even though it was hidden behind trees. Revered as a summit by some and a cliff by others, Steep Rock has been at the heart of a cultural landscape that has influenced Americans' ideas about being American for thousands of years. The steep rocky cliff and the view from its peak would surely have awed the Paleo Indians who camped in the area as the glaciers receded. Later, the sheer rise of the bedrock face would have amazed early settlers who paddled their way up the Shippog River, discovering a new world. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when people struggled with nature for survival, the river supported farming and industrial activities. In Rossiter's day, the landscape, both beautiful and sublime, attracted people from all walks of life seeking respite from an increasingly urbanized world. Today, we honor Steep Rock's ecological value. Its old-growth forests filter the air we breathe, and the clear, cold, free-flowing river protects the water we drink. As reported by the New Milford Gazette, circa 1895, the Rossiter Drives have been laid out by E.K. Rossiter, one of the most public-spirited men in Washington, a man whose efforts for the public good have not been exceeded by any other citizen of that town. He is a man who loves what is good and beautiful, an ardent admirer of nature, who cannot bear to see the country recklessly bereft of trees and left bare and uninviting. He is a man who the ruthless woodchopper does not regard with favor, but whose course is approved by those inhabitants of a picturesque region who do not wish to see it deprived of its great natural advantages. His work is appreciated now, but its importance will be far more valued in the future when it will be evident that but for him, Washington would have lost scenic attractions which, unmarred and conscientiously preserved, should be enjoyed by all succeeding generations. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. This has just been tremendous. It's wonderful. It's absolutely fantastic. We have questions. I have a question to begin, and I know that we've had a number of questions that have come up in the chat box. But first question is, when Ehrick Rossiter founded the SRA in 1925, were land trusts a well-established form of land conservation?
It's a very interesting question. And Steep Rock was definitely on the forefront of the group. The first land trust was established in Massachusetts by the trustees of reservations in 1891. In the next few decades, a number of conservation-minded organizations such as the Audubon Society were founded. However, the rate of land trust formation was slow, and by the mid-20th century, there were fewer than 50 land trusts thought to have existed. Rapid growth began with the emergence of the environmental movement in the 1960s, and by the 1980s, when the Land Trust Alliance was founded, more than 400 land trusts were in existence.
Here's another question. Can you describe how you went about finding the locations where Joseph West stood when taking his original photographs?
You know, finding those spots, the whole process was a bit like working on a jigsaw puzzle. After a slow start and a lot of failed attempts, the pieces began to fall into place. As a landscape architect, I was trained to read the landscape, and I found the topography to be particularly revealing. As an art historian, I learned how to peruse archives. So for this project, I studied a lot of old maps and aerial photographs, as well as all of the photographs by Joseph West in the Gunn Museum, of which there's several hundred. At the same time, I hiked in Steep Rock Park for hours at a time, taking thousands of pictures. I walked the trails almost every day during the first 9 months of COVID, often with copies of Joseph West photographs in hand. It was a wonderful place to quarantine.
Stephen, I think that you've seen some questions come in from the chat room. Do you have any that you can share?
Yes, thank you so much. One of the questions that came in is, what happened to the Rossiter and West families? And do they still live in the area?
Yeah, so it's hard to know how close their relationship was. Certainly, my sense is that Rossiter was probably a client of Joseph West, and that they probably knew each other pretty well because of all of the photographs that West took of Rossiter's land. You know, Rossiter was, you know, he was more or less a weekender. So whereas West lived full time in the area. So you know, they probably, it was probably a professional relationship. Any other questions?
Yeah, definitely. Rossiter designed and planted the avenue of pines leading up to Steep Rock. Are there other examples where he took a more detailed interest in the flora of Steep Rock?
You know, I don't really think so. Rossiter, he was trained as an architect, and he may have gotten some instruction in landscape architecture at Cornell, or maybe he just had a feel for the land. Not all landscape architects know a lot about plants. Sometimes they focus on plant materials that serve architectural purposes. My guess is that this was what Rossiter did. The Avenue of Pines and Pine Drive were situated in an area that had been cleared of trees before Rossiter came along. Essentially, he added architectural elements to the landscape by planting the white pines in these two areas.
So which of Joseph West's photographs were easiest, and then which were hardest to replicate?
You know, it surprised me at first, but it didn't take long for me to figure out that the trails in the Steep Rock Preserve have not changed much in the past 100 years. Rossiter's carriage roads are today's trails. They're lined often by the same trees growing in the same places. The huge rocks embedded in the Chappaqua River have not moved. The cut and fill accomplished by Rossiter's work crews are still easy to see. The thing that changed the most were the fields. The fields on the clamshell that had been logged and farmed before Rossiter came along and were very likely maintained as open space by Rossiter are now filled with trees. And sadly, trees now block many of the views seen in West photographs. And those they're the photos I struggle to replicate the most.
So I do have your book and I've been reading it with great interest, but would you say we just got a summary of your book with this lecture?
Not really. I took a very small portion of the book and expanded upon it for this lecture. The history of Steep Rock Association touches on Rossiter's contributions, but it really focuses on the decades after the land trust was founded in 1925. It discusses the organization's 3, soon to be 4, publicly accessible preserves, which cover almost 2,500 acres. And it's more based on the association's newsletters and meeting minutes. It focuses on the struggles and accomplishments of the hundreds of people who have been involved in making the preserves the amazing places they are today.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Carol, for this excellent lecture and presenting your interesting then and now comparisons of present-day photographic perspectives with Gunn Museum's Joseph West photographs. With your stunning photographs, I think you've inspired our audience this evening to explore those special parts of Steep Rock that are frankly hidden in plain sight. That's how I felt about it. I'd also like to personally thank Dr. Brian Hagenbush, the Executive Director of Steep Rock Association, for co-sponsoring this lecture with the Gunn Historical Museum, and certainly all of you in our audience for attending this wonderful lecture. Have a good evening, and thank you.
Thank you.